All right, good morning, Valerie. For all you guys listening, this is going to be a really, really interesting episode because we're finally getting a chance to really tackle and talk about something which has come up in many previous interviews, which I think for a lot of people is a big reason why they're so scared to really show up and be seen on video, and that is imposter syndrome. What we have today for you is Valerie Young. So, she's an internationally recognized imposter syndrome expert. She's an award-winning author. She's a speaker. She works with, big corporations. And most impressively of all is that she still has everyone fooled. Nobody knows that she's a complete fake, fraud, and a phony and doesn't deserve to be where she is or doing what she's doing. Which, of course, is a joke because we're talking about imposter syndrome today. Valerie's actually great. So before we get too much further, Valerie, could you describe for us what imposter syndrome is?
Sure, absolutely. And by the way, the reason I even talk about this topic, Jonathan, is because I did feel like a big imposter when I was in graduate school. So basically, imposter syndrome, it's actually more accurately known as the imposter phenomenon. It's not really a psychological syndrome. It just somehow morphed into that over the decades. But it was imposter phenomenon was something that was discovered and named, I should say, in like 1978 by Dr. Pauline Clance and Dr. Suzanne Imes. And what they found is that a lot of bright, capable, competent people feel like they're fooling other folks. They dismiss or diminish their accomplishments or abilities, and they chalk them up to things like, well, I was just lucky, or I was in the right place at the right time. Maybe I was a legacy admission to college. I had a connection to help me get the job. A lot of people helped me start my business or whatever it might be. So then the next time we go to accomplish something, it's emotionally unclear to us how we got there. So the only explanation is that we have somehow fooled them. And if you think you've been fooling people, then your biggest fear, of course, is going to be being found out.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So have you heard, because imposter syndrome is a word that I hear thrown around a lot all the time all over the internet. And I'm really glad that people are finally starting to recognize it and talk about it. That really is incredible. Due in a large part, right, of course, to the work of folks like yourself. Has it reached the point yet where it's like being maybe overused and misunderstood, like many terms of pop psychology end up getting to when they get a certain level of, public awareness, people start using it incorrectly? Do you see that?
I'm really glad you asked that question because you're the first person to ask it, and it's a really good question. Sometimes, Jonathan, people think, oh, it's just a fancy term for low self-esteem. Some studies have found a connection, other studies find no connection. So it's possible to have healthy self-esteem and not feel like an imposter. I think of self-esteem as this kind of global feeling we have about ourselves, but imposter syndrome is very specific to achievement arenas: work, school, business, career. You don't feel like an imposter when you're walking the dog or emptying the dishwasher or putting gas in your car, but you might when you go on a job interview, or, oh my God, they gave you the job, or you get promoted, or you're just launching your business or trying to get your art into a gallery, or, whatever those moments are that trigger that I'm in over my head and they're going to find out feeling. The other way I'm seeing it being misunderstood is it's becoming like a catch-all for any form of inauthenticity.
Hmm.
So there's actually somebody who wanted me to endorse her book, and I couldn't because she gave examples like, gay men pretending to be straight. That's not imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
I thought the most egregious was pedophiles pretending they weren't attracted to children. I'm like, no, I cannot put my name on this book. And she was a psychologist. So, just because you don't feel maybe genuine, or maybe you're in the wrong career, and so it's not a good fit, and you feel like you're faking your way through this career, that's not the same as feeling like you don't deserve your success. It just means you're having to kind of fake your way through a job you don't like, which many people do. One of my favorite quotes is, "The truth is rarely told between the hours of 9 to 5."
Yeah. Huh. So I have I guess, experience that I've called imposter syndrome before, which I'm curious if it does fall into the category, if it falls into something else. But my experience isn't necessarily a fear of being found out. For me,
Mhm.
mine is this sensation that everyone already knows. Whenever I do something, like when I started my podcast, or when I interview a big name on LinkedIn Live, or just anything that I do is kind of like pushing the boundaries of what I've done before and pushing the boundaries of my career and my profession. I always have this crushing sensation that everyone is looking around going, who the hell does John think he is? He's trying to
Right.
be someone he's not. He's trying to pretend to be some kind of big shot. Stop posing, stop posturing. You're a nobody and admit it. Sit back down, stay in your lane.
Right.
So it's not like a fear of being found out. It's this, I don't know, shame or terror of the fact that everyone already knows I'm a fake, right? Is that under the umbrella of imposter syndrome? Was that something else?
I think it's a very close cousin.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people who feel like imposters do have that voice that says, "Who do you think you are?"
Yeah.
And people are going to think, I mean, because behind that, though, Jonathan, if they're thinking like, who does this guy think he is? Then by definition, it suggests that they're questioning your credentials and
Sure.
ability, which is, can evoke those kinds of feelings. And you mentioned shame. And I think it's important because nobody likes to fail, make a mistake, have an off day, not know the answer, flub a podcast or a presentation or a client meeting, have to ask for help. But when these things happen to people who feel like imposters, we experience shame.
Yeah.
And the reason we feel shame is people who feel like imposters have these exaggerated, unrealistic, unsustainable ideas about what it means to be competent. So they hold themselves up to this kind of bar, this unrealistic set of expectations. And when they fall short, even in a very small way, on some level, they feel shame.
Where does where does imposter syndrome even come from? Like, why is it such a prevalent thing, right? And on some levels, it doesn't really make sense. As a species who, in general, likes to keep our view of ourselves and our ego high, a lot of
Mhm.
times, like we will take the most generous interpretation of events and the most generous interpretation of what's happened to make ourselves look and feel good. It almost feels like imposter syndrome is the opposite. We're like we're mentally going out of our way to make sure we feel like crap about ourselves
Right.
instead of just accepting the natural reaction of feeling good about ourselves. So why is it so common? Where does it come from?
That's a great question. Because especially when you look at somebody like Tom Hanks or Tina Fey or Maya Angelou or recent study, 80% of CEOs in the UK, right? So you look at people who by any measure are accomplished, by any measure are competent and capable, and they have talked about feeling like imposters, then you know that something's horribly wrong here, right? So my frame for the sources, Jonathan, is perfectly good reasons why you might feel like a fraud. I mean, on the one hand, there are messages from family. So if you were raised by humans, for example, you have a far greater chance of feeling like an imposter than if you weren't. Because your human parents were raised by humans and they were raised by humans. And being human, sometimes parents might pass along some messaging that would lead a kid to grow up and feel like an imposter. And I can give you examples of that if that's useful.
Oh,
But I'm
please
also
do.
not a big fan of it's not one thing, it's your mother, right? Because psychology, and I'm not a psychologist, which I think is really good news, because psychology tends to look almost exclusively at family messages, and even teachers can give kids some messages. But we don't exist in a vacuum. There's situational factors. Just being a student, college student, especially getting an advanced degree, the more advanced degree you're going for, the bigger fraud you feel like. Working alone, people who are self-employed, and now so many people are working remotely. So these feelings are definitely kind of up a lot more for people. People in certain fields are more susceptible, creative fields, actors, writers, producers,
Mm.
artists, because they're being judged by subjective standards by people whose job title is professional critic. People in STEM, science, technology, medicine, even law, areas where there's a lot of, with law, like gray areas, but that's very information dense, where you're surrounded by other highly educated people and that are rapidly changing. Organizational culture can fuel self-doubt. And also I want to say social factors. A sense of belonging fosters confidence. So when you walk into a meeting or an interview or a job or the executive level in an organization, the more people who sound like or look like you, the more confident you feel. The more people who sound like you, maybe you have a strong regional accent, or English is not yours, well, just one of your languages, but it's not your first language. A working class kind of accent, right? So it can
Hmm.
affect us. So people who are working internationally, women, people of color, people with disabilities, because whenever you're on the receiving end of stereotypes, you've got around competence, you've got that kind of pressure to kind of represent your entire group. And I'm just going to add one more, is age. I think on some level, to different degrees, we all know what it's like to feel underestimated when we're the youngest person in a work setting, or maybe the oldest person. When I ask employees at Facebook, which is one of my clients, how many of you have ever felt like you're the oldest person in the room and you feel underestimated? The 30-year-olds raise their hand. So it's all kind of relative.
Yeah, right.
So lots of reasons: situational, social, organizational, family.
Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. Would you say that, and actually I'm curious, you may know some data on this. Has this gotten any worse or more prevalent with the rise of social media? Because of course the whole idea of social media is you see everyone else's highlights, right? And it encourages you to set that unrealistically high bar. So has that made it worse or has it remained constant?
I'm not aware of studies. It's not that they're not out there. I just don't know of any. But I can't imagine that it's not a factor.
Yeah.
We can't all be living our best life all at the same time.
Right.
But there, we already were in a kind of a culture of comparison. Now we have, millions of people to compare ourselves to. And you don't see the process. You only see the end result. Your listeners, your viewers might want to Google Princeton professor failure CV. He's a tenured professor at Princeton. He posted his very impressive CV resume, and then he also posted his failure CV. Here's the publications that rejected him. Here's the grants he didn't get. Here's the jobs he was turned down for. And it kind of rocked the academic world, which is crazy, but it makes sense because we think success is like this, straight line, and success is more, peaks and valleys, and that's real life.
That's so cool. Love that. All right. So, now we understand a little bit more about imposter syndrome and what it is, and why people have it. So I guess now we kind of, shift the interview to talk a bit more about, what to do about it, right? Now that we've identified this thing that's holding people back, right? And I'll kind of add in here, in my experience, it's a big part of what makes people uncomfortable to show up on camera, because being on video really makes you visible in ways that, something typed up doesn't, right? A lot of people will be very confident typing up an article and sharing it to LinkedIn because they have total control over every single word in that article. And if they need to go in there and, surgically change a few words, they can. But, hopping on there and doing a public webinar or, posting a 5-minute video to LinkedIn, there's less control in video, because you pretty much start and then you go to the end, and when it's done, then you either post it or you don't post it, right? And there's a lot of mess in the middle that can come through from saying the wrong thing and forgetting to make the right point and your hair not looking good and, doing a weird, awkward thing with your hand. Like, there's a lot that's not under your control. And it can feel like when you're on camera, the mask is torn off, right? This public persona you've worked so hard to put up, this wall you've put up to keep people fooled as to who you are, it all comes down when you're on camera. So I think this is a big thing with video in particular, where people with imposter syndrome are terrified of putting themselves out on camera because it feels like the most dangerous thing they can do, because it exposes them, right, for who they really are. So for people who are watching this, right, are kind of trying to get themselves comfortable being on camera, we need to talk a little bit about how to work through this, right? How to get to the point where you don't feel so much imposter syndrome. And I think maybe even, we'll pivot later and talk a bit about how to just act anyways, even when you do feel it. So I guess the next topic would be, what are some things people can do, steps they can take to not feel it so strongly, to not feel imposter syndrome so acutely, or maybe to not feel it as often?
Well, a few things. One is to normalize imposter syndrome. One of the reasons I took the time, Jonathan, to go through some of the perfectly good reasons why you might feel like a fraud is so that when you have a normal imposter moment, you can kind of look around and go, well, of course I feel this way. I've never done this before, or there's not a lot of people who look like me, or I'm in medicine, or I'm in STEM, or I'm in a creative field, or I'm working alone, whatever it might be. I'm the first generation in my family to go to college. That's another, category of folks who are more susceptible. So it's important because that way we do less psychologizing, less personalizing, and more contextualizing, and say, it makes sense. Of course I do. And therefore other people around me more than likely do as well. And also to recognize that up to 70% of people have these feelings at one time or another, probably more. And the higher you are, the bigger the number is, the bigger the percentage.
Yeah.
Which means that we're in the majority, right? So what's up with the other 30? What's going on with that? So some part of that 30 has a whole different issue going on, irrational self-confidence syndrome.
Sure.
Right? Their sense of their abilities and knowledge far exceeds their actual abilities and knowledge, which has been proven. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, Professor Dunning at Cornell University found that students who were like so sure, I aced it, I'm the bomb, I'm the smartest guy in the room, they would do the worst on a test. The student who was convinced it's going to be terrible, I'm going to fail, they would do the best. So it normalizes one thing. The other one, though, is to recognize that people who don't feel like imposters, they may look or sound more confident, but they're no more intelligent, capable, competent than the rest of us. It's just in the exact same moment where we feel like an imposter, they're thinking different thoughts, which is good news because it just means we need to learn to think like them. And when I say think like them, I don't mean just like, you've got this, Jonathan, and you can do it, and you deserve to be here, all of which are true. But that's not going to move the needle in any real lasting way. They think differently about competence and what that means. They think differently about, I'm going to put this in one category, failure, mistakes, and criticism. And they think differently about fear. So three things: competence, failure, mistakes, and criticism, and fear. So the example you gave about the person who is afraid to come on or is anxious about coming on, it may be because they don't want the mask ripped off. It could also be that the number one fear is public speaking. The number two fear is death.
Yeah.
So, as Seinfeld says, what that really means is you'd rather be in the casket than delivering the eulogy. It might be like I do podcasts all the time. I speak to major corporations, audiences of hundreds of people, thousands of people in some cases, and I'm like incredibly comfortable there. Put me in front of put me on the Today Show or something like that, and that would be very stressful for me. And it's not because I'm afraid that I don't know what I'm doing. It's that there's normal anxiety and fear around that kind of platform. The stakes are higher. But also, like, you're talking in sound bites. It's just not, I'm not as comfortable in that arena.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are some of the differences in the way people see particular competence? I'm curious, these people who don't suffer from imposter syndrome, how do they see competence compared to, the rest of us?
Well, I'll give you an example. Well, there's different competence ways we view competence, right? The perfectionist who feels like it has to be 99 out of 100 would be failure. For getting off a podcast and remembering you forgot to make some minor point. That's the person who would beat themselves up endlessly because they want it to be Academy Award winning every single time. The kind of the knowledge version of that is the expert who feels like I have to know 150% before I launch my podcast or write my book or start my business or raise my hand in a meeting. So the opposite of that would be, we all know what it's like, for example, to be in a class or meeting and we don't understand, but we don't want to raise our hand because we don't want to sound stupid, right? Look stupid. And then someone else asks our question and they go, oh, brilliant. That's a great question. You're like, oh, damn, that was my question, right? So my advice is the difference between, what I will call them kind of a non-imposter would think. They would confidently raise their hand and go, excuse me, I'm not following. Could you explain that? Is there another way you could put that? Do you mean this or do you mean that? Because they feel entitled to not understand. And I'm using entitled in the best sense of the word. So the opposite of the perfectionist is a person who still has a healthy drive to excel. But if they do mess up or fall short, they don't feel shame. It's like if they gave it their best shot, then they don't have anything to be ashamed about. I was speaking in front of 400 healthcare executives in Orlando, and I started coughing on stage. I said, excuse me. And I stepped to the side of the stage and I drank some water. And I came back and I said, how many of you would be mortified right now if that happened to you? People raised their hand. And I said, yeah, I don't care. And it's not that would I rather not coughed? Of course, but I have it in perspective now. No one stormed. So I used it as a teachable moment, right? No one stormed out of the room saying, I'm not listening to this coughing speaker one more second. We've all coughed. It's okay. Like, just sometimes you have to just kind of laugh and move on, but that's much harder for someone who feels like an imposter to do.
Yeah. So it's almost like people who are, you call them non-imposters, right? Don't go through that struggle. They have a lot more flexible definition of competence, and their definition of competence leaves plenty of room for not knowing, not understanding.
And to be more forgiving of themselves.
Yeah.
To say, we all have an off day.
Yeah.
I'll get them next time, right? It's like sports, right? Intellectually, we know somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. And the losing team is going to be crying in their towel.
Yeah.
but they're not going to hang up their uniform and go home. They're going to go get more coaching. They're going to practice, and they're going to say, we'll get them next time. So your person who might be anxious about coming on the podcast, they expect their first podcast to be flawless and perfect. But, the other competence types, I've named two, perfectionist and expert, is the natural genius. That's the person who thinks, it doesn't mean they think they're a genius or they should be a genius, but they think if I was really competent, I would just knock it out of the park the first time. I would just sit down and write my book, and my fingers would just type on the page, as opposed to like hundreds of edits.
Yeah.
And the reality is, the non-imposter realizes, well, the more I do anything, the better I'll get. The more I do podcasts, the better I'll be being interviewed. The more I write, the better writer I'll be. The more I manage, hopefully the better manager I'll be. That takes
Yeah.
some work, though, to be a good manager.
Yeah. Do you think some of this mentality comes from films we watch as kids? Because most, protagonists and heroes in films are just right. And I don't know, this seems like it's changing, but they are just naturally good at what they do, right? They're the best at what they do. They're the Hercules, the one who can do things other people can't do. Is that
Yeah.
part of where that comes from? Is there other sources of why people think,
As part of it. Well, because you don't see the journey.
yeah,
You only see them walk on stage and get the Academy Award. You only see the painting in the gallery when they're famous. You don't see or an entrepreneur, right? You see the end result on Shark Tank. The entrepreneur sitting there.
yeah,
You don't see the setbacks and the struggles and the failures and the challenges. And so it to our mind, it looks easy. And so if it's hard for you or you're struggling in your business, like, guess what? Everybody struggles in their business. My great uncle Buddy, he played the mandolin, the violin, the guitar, etc. When I was like 10, I wanted him to teach me how to play the guitar. Well, that lasted for like 10 minutes because I didn't want to learn how to play the guitar.
yeah.
I wanted to play the guitar. That whole struggle process that a lot of us don't even know exists and don't want to go through, if we do know.
Yeah. Interesting. So a big part you're saying of feeling less of this imposter syndrome is just recognizing how many people go through it. I imagine along with that, right? If you can find someone to talk to about your imposter syndrome, that probably helps alleviate it.
I think it's a really good first step to kind of name the feelings and talk about it. My caution there, Jonathan, is some people get stuck there and they literally spend years coming home at the end of the day and telling their spouse or partner, oh my God, the big thing, presentations tomorrow, I know I'm going to be found, whatever, over and over, ruminating. And nothing really changes, which is interesting because a psychologist came up to me when I was speaking at a medical school, and they were doing research on adolescents. And they found that adolescents it's called co-ruminating, adolescents who dwelled on negative thoughts and feelings with their friends actually experienced higher levels of depression and anxiety. So do talk about it, but don't get stuck there.
Yeah.
You want to normalize it. You want to reframe, to step back and go. So let's say you're given a big assignment and you've never done it before, instead of saying, oh my God, I have no idea what I'm doing, to say, wow, I'm really going to learn a lot. Or I've never done this, but I can figure it out, and kind of jump in and allow yourself to kind of figure it out as you go. And you had mentioned, how do you, people want to feel less like an imposter. Feelings are the last to change. Feelings are the last to change. The only way to stop feeling like an imposter is to stop thinking like an imposter. And then the last thing is to kind of keep going regardless of how you feel. Because if you're waiting to feel 100% confident before you launch your podcast or start your business or go for the promotion, the day may never come. So do the thing that scares you, that you're not 100% confident you can do. Jump in and talk to other people, get help, get mentoring, coaching, call somebody else who's doing it, read books, figure it out, and trust that you can bumble your way through it, as we all do.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think there is this general human assumption and human bias, right? That you want to stop feeling the thing you're feeling, and once that feeling dissipates, then move forward. In fact, that bias is even revealed in the order I asked these questions, right? The first thing I asked you was, how do you feel less like an imposter? And then later we'll get to how do you act anyways? But it seems like that's probably reversed, right? First you need to start acting anyways, and then work on feeling
Change your thoughts, even if you don't believe the new thoughts.
okay.
Somebody said to me, "This is great, Valerie," right? I'm doing a talk and she says, "This is great, but what if we don't believe the new thoughts?" And my response is, "No, you won't believe the new thoughts. Trust me, you will not believe the new thoughts. You believe the old thoughts. You believe 25 people give you an evaluation and 24 people said you were great. One person says you suck. That was the worst thing I've ever heard. Who do you believe?" Right? That's the old thoughts. The
Mhm.
new thought is, well, I guess they were having an off day.
Yeah.
24 people thought I was great. You can't please everybody. It's a different way of processing, in this case, criticism.
Yeah. Okay. So step one, right, is identify the thoughts that are causing you grief,
Yep. Yep.
right? And then replace them with alternative thoughts, even if you
Right.
don't believe.
Reframe. Yep.
Huh. I like it. I like it. So
And part
believing
of
them is
reframing, again, might be putting it in context. Michelle Obama last fall talked about her own imposter syndrome.
Mhm.
She was speaking to high school girls in London. And she talked about her imposter syndrome, and the internet erupted like, "Oh my God, how could Michelle Obama have imposter syndrome? She's very accomplished. Apart from being first lady, she was accomplished in her own right. How could she feel this way?" My response was, how could she not? How could she not? I wrote an article at impostersyndrome.com called Unpacking Michelle Obama's Imposter Syndrome. She grew up in a working class family. She was underestimated by teachers. Guidance counselors said she wasn't Princeton material, went to Princeton anyway, was outstanding at Princeton, has multiple advanced degrees, had her own career in a number of different arenas, but she had a good connection. There's no getting around the fact that she had the best connection in the world when she obviously married
Yeah.
the person who would become the president, right? And she understands that she didn't do anything herself to necessarily get there. So there's, it makes sense that she would have these imposter feelings. And much of this, the solutions that I'm talking to you about are also in that article if people want to review.
Yeah. Okay. So identify the thoughts that are causing you grief, find
Yep.
alternative thoughts to replace them with, right?
Yep.
And that is kind of the first step. But then before the feelings really dissipate, action is what's needed next in most cases, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I guess, any particular advice on how to just make yourself take action when you're terrified, right? Because for a lot of people, they describe their fears truly being paralyzing. Like they feel
Right.
like they lose their autonomy and they can't press play, they can't press send, they can't, take that step.
Sure.
Any help you found to get people to take action despite?
Yeah. I mean, I think depending on, what the action is, but, it's getting advice, mentoring, coaching, looking at other examples of people who are doing the thing that you want to do. That can be helpful. I'm considered a very successful speaker. But I've paid a lot of money to be mentored and coached by people who are, at another level of speaking. And I'm paying them not to tell me I'm great. I'm paying them really good money to tell me where my blind spots are, and where I can get better. But I also think, it, there was a study at Hewlett Packard that found when people apply for a job internal employees, if there's 10 criteria for a job, men would apply if they had on average 6 of the criteria. Women would apply if they had 10. So to the women, I would say, and the reason the men would apply when they have 6 is they're like, well, I've never done this and this and this and this, but they understand, I think a lot of men and quote unquote non-imposters understand that you're not being hired because you've done this for 20 years. You're being hired because they know you have the capacity
Yeah.
to figure it out. And that's why a CEO will go from a manufacturing company to a service company or whatever. They've never been in that other industry, but they know how to be a leader.
Yeah.
And I know they can figure out the business.
Yeah.
So trust yourself to be able to also to wing it a little bit and practice. I got asked to go to do a 6-minute TED talk at TED headquarters in New York. There was 10 of us, so thousands of people applied. I felt very honored to get this spot. 6 minutes, really hard to have a beginning, middle, and an end.
Right.
I was saying things, Jonathan, that I have said literally thousands of times, but not in the order I had to do it in 6 minutes. It took a plus up. You send in, people think it's kind of off the cuff. You send in your talk to TED. And by the way, they edit if people screw up on stage, but you send in your talk in writing and then they send you back feedback. But anyway, so it took me hundreds of hours to write it, rewrite. And I practiced that hundreds of hours with a timer. And I was very familiar with the material. Yeah. So again, when you look at someone, don't think, oh, it's easy for them. It takes a lot of work to make it look easy. So, do the work, jump in and do the work.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, that like, it's okay, right, that it takes that much work. I think you mentioned earlier, a lot of people feel like, oh, if I was actually legitimate, this wouldn't be so hard, right? The fact that it's so hard means I'm an imposter. So.
Right. And that's that natural genius I mentioned. They think, they define competence as being about ease and speed.
Yeah.
And that's nothing worth doing. And guess what? We're all naturally good at some things. I'm really good at like 3 things. I'm okay at a couple of things, and I suck at everything else. And I'm good with that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so cool. All right. So, this has been a great, introductory talk to the topic, right? We'll be able to cover a fair amount in this 30 minutes. But obviously there's a heck of a lot more to the world of imposter syndrome. So if somebody's listening to this and they want to start taking action to, feel less like an imposter, but most importantly to, be able to act despite feeling like an imposter.
To talk themselves down faster. That's the goal, to talk yourself down faster.
Interesting. All right. What would you recommend, right? What's the next step? Where can people go on the internet? What books can people read? I don't even know. What are the steps for someone who says, all right, enough. I want to live my life differently for the next 20 years than, the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Obviously listening to one podcast episode isn't enough. So what's the next for people who feel inspired by this?
Yeah. I mean, for people who want to, do that deeper dive and have more of an understanding, I mean, obviously just, there's many hundreds and hundreds of dissertations out there if you want to, academic perspective. At impostersyndrome.com, which is my site, there are a number of blogs posts that I put up. For example, one is like why embracing your imposter syndrome is a really bad idea. Because sometimes you hear people say, well, the key is to embrace it because it means you're learning. And yeah, that's true. But I'd like to be learning without all the baggage that comes along with imposter syndrome. I'd love people to buy my book if that's of interest. It's called The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women. And I want to be really clear. I hate the title. Random House named it. I didn't want that title. There's definitely some aspects of it that are geared towards women because as a group, women are more susceptible. But men have told me that they have found it very useful. So don't let the title be a barrier.
Cool. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. So your website says impostersyndrome.com. Your book, where should people find that?
They can just go to Amazon or wherever they get things online. And you know what? There's actually a free chapter, and it's impostersyndrome.com/bonus. So imposter syndrome /bonus. I'm not going to be sending you a bunch of emails. I'm mostly, my clients are, corporations and associations and universities. So you don't have to worry about now you're on my list and I'm going to be hounding you to do stuff. I won't. Good to know.
Good to know. We've all given our email address to get a free piece of content and live to regret it. So appreciate the clarification. All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for your, pardon me. Hey, speaking of having to clear your throat in the middle of a talk, right?
There you go.
This time of year.
Guess what? We all survived it, Jonathan.
This time of year, I feel like I'm clearing my throat like every 10 minutes. Like that's just all I do for like 3 months.
I'm right with you. I did a 3-hour, a 90-minute webinar yesterday for a big law firm, and it was tough because I just had to keep clearing my throat. It's that time of year.
Yeah. So anyways, thanks so much for your time, Valerie. This is an awesome topic to finally have a chance to really unpack. So yeah, thanks for your time.
Thank you, and great job.
Thanks.